Chapter 1. The Bennets' New Neighbour. It is a truth well known to all the world that an unmarried man in possession of a large fortune must be in need of a wife. And when such a man moves into a neighbourhood, even if nothing is known about his feelings or opinions, this truth is so clear to the surrounding families that they think of him immediately as the future husband of one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband one day, "have you heard that someone is going to rent Netherfield Park at last?" "No, Mrs. Bennet, I haven't," said her husband. "Don't you want to know who is renting it?" cried Mrs. Bennet impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I don't mind listening." Mrs. Bennet needed no further encouragement. "Well, my dear, I hear that he's a very rich young man from the north of England. It seems he came to see Netherfield on Monday, and was so delighted with it that he arranged to rent it at once. Of course, it is the finest house in the area, with the largest gardens. His servants will be here by the end of the week, and he will be arriving soon afterwards." "What is his name?" asked Mr. Bennet. "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, of course. A single man of large fortune. He has an income of £4,000 or £5,000 a year. How wonderful for our girls!" "Why? How can it affect them?" Mr. Bennet asked. "My dear Mr. Bennet," she replied, "how can you be so annoying? You must realise I'm thinking of his marrying one of our daughters." "Is that his purpose in coming to the area?" "His purpose? No, of course not. But it's very likely that he'll fall in love with one of them. And I want him to see the girls as soon as possible, before our other neighbours introduce themselves. So you must visit him as soon as he arrives." "I really don't see why I should," said Mr. Bennet. "You and the girls can visit him. Or perhaps you should send them by themselves. Yes, that might be better, as you're as attractive as any of them, and Mr. Bingley might like you best." "Oh, my dear, you flatter me," replied his wife. "I certainly have been called beautiful in the past, but I think a woman with 5 adult daughters should stop thinking of her own beauty. Mr. Bennet, I beg you to visit him. You know it's correct for the gentleman of the family to visit new neighbours first. I simply cannot take the girls to see him unless you have already met him." "Surely you worry too much about the rules of polite society. I'm sure Mr. Bingley will be delighted to see you all, and I'll write him a few lines, which you can give him, agreeing gladly to his marrying any of the girls, although I must especially recommend my dear little Lizzie." "Oh, no, Mr. Bennet!" gasped Mrs. Bennet, horrified. "Please don't do that. And Lizzie is no better than the others, although I know she is your favourite." "Our daughters are all very silly, ignorant girls, it's true, but at least Lizzie is a little more intelligent than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you speak so unkindly of your own children? Oh, dear, how ill I feel. Have you no pity for me? Don't you realise how I suffer?" "Indeed, my dear, I've suffered with you for the last 23 years, but I think you will recover and live to see many more rich young men come into the neighbourhood." When he was young, Mr. Bennet had made the mistake of falling in love with a pretty but foolish young woman. During the long years of their marriage, he had had time to regret his mistake. He soon realised that his wife had little intelligence or common sense, and was only interested in talking, shopping, and finding husbands for her daughters. His experience had made him rather bitter, and he could not stop himself mocking his wife, who never understood her husband's sense of humour. So, when, a week later, Mrs. Bennet discovered that her husband had in fact visited Mr. Bingley at Netherfield, she was surprised and very pleased. But she and her daughters tried in vain to persuade Mr. Bennet to describe the wealthy stranger, and in the end they had to rely on another neighbour's description. "He sounds wonderful, Mamma," cried Lydia, the youngest and noisiest of the sisters.
"Charlotte Lucas's father has been to see him and says he's quite young, very handsome and extremely charming. And even better, he loves dancing. Everybody knows that means he's very likely to fall in love."
As politeness required, Mr. Bingley came to visit Mr. Bennet a few days later. He was not, however, fortunate enough to see the Bennet girls, who were hiding behind the curtains in an upstairs room in order to catch sight of the handsome stranger. Mrs. Bennet planned to invite him to dinner, but in fact they met him at another social event first. The Bennets lived in the small Hertfordshire village of Longbourn, and public dances were regularly held in the nearest town, Meryton. The girls were greatly looking forward to this particular dance, because they had heard that Mr. Bingley would be attending with a group of friends from London. On the night of the dance, all eyes were on Mr. Bingley as he entered the room. He had brought his two sisters, with the husband of the elder, Mr. Hurst, and another young man, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley was indeed good-looking and gentlemanlike, and his sisters were fine, fashionable women. However, everybody was soon talking about Mr. Darcy, a tall, handsome man, who, it was said, had an income of £10,000 a year. The ladies in the room gazed at him in admiration for about half the evening, until they became aware of his constant frown and his unwillingness to talk or dance. Then there was general agreement that he was proud and disagreeable, and considered himself superior to country people. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, made himself popular with the ladies by dancing every dance and talking to everybody. As there were not as many gentlemen as ladies, Elizabeth Bennet did not have a partner for one of the dances, and was sitting watching the dancing. Mr. Darcy was standing near her, and when Mr. Bingley came up to speak to his friend, Elizabeth could not avoid hearing their conversation. "Come, Darcy," said Bingley, "I hate to see you looking so cross. Why don't you dance with one of these lovely girls?" "Certainly not," replied Darcy. "You know how I hate dancing with a partner I don't know. I would particularly dislike it at a village dance like this. Apart from your sisters, there isn't a woman in the room I would even consider dancing with. You were dancing with the only attractive girl here." He was looking at Mrs. Bennet's eldest daughter, Jane, who was waiting for Bingley to join her for the next dance. "Oh, yes, she's the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. But just behind you is one of her sisters. She's very pretty, and I'm sure she's very pleasant. My partner could introduce you." "Who do you mean?" And Darcy turned to look at Elizabeth for a moment. "No," he said coldly. "She's not attractive enough to tempt me. Go back to your partner, Bingley." This conversation did not endear Mr. Darcy to Elizabeth, but she told the story very cheerfully and amusingly to her friends. The evening passed very happily for everybody else, and Mrs. Bennet was delighted with the effect her eldest daughter had had on Mr. Bingley. "He danced with Jane twice," she told her husband later. "He danced with all the others only once. And he really is so handsome. But his friend, Mr. Darcy, was so rude to poor Elizabeth. Luckily she doesn't care. She wouldn't want to please him. Such a horrible, proud man. I simply hate him." When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, they discussed their dancing partners.
"I was really very flattered when Mr. Bingley asked me to dance a second time," said Jane, blushing. "I didn't expect it at all."
"Didn't you?" said Elizabeth. "I did. Dear Jane, you were 5 times prettier than any other woman in the room, but you're too modest ever to expect admiration."
"I have to admit that I liked Mr. Bingley," continued Jane in her gentle voice. "He's so good-mannered and agreeable."
"He's also handsome," added her sister, "which makes his character quite perfect. But what did you think of his sisters?"
"Very pleasant when you get to know them. The younger, Miss Caroline Bingley, will be living at Netherfield with her brother. I'm sure we'll enjoy having her as a neighbour."
Elizabeth listened in silence, She was not convinced. Jane is so kind, she thought, always ready to see the good side of people's characters. I considered Mr. Bingley's sisters too proud, almost rude, in fact. I'm sure they feel superior to most other people, like Mr. Darcy. But she did not say any more. After the dance, the Bennet and Bingley families began to visit each other every few days. It became evident that Mr. Bingley admired Jane very much, and Elizabeth knew that her sister was close to falling in love with him. She was discussing this with her good friend Charlotte Lucas one day. Charlotte was a sensible, intelligent young woman of 27, the eldest daughter of Sir William and Lady Lucas, who were neighbours of the Bennet family. "It's a good thing," said Elizabeth, "that if Jane is in love with Mr. Bingley, nobody will know, because she always behaves so cheerfully and normally." "That's sometimes a mistake," replied Charlotte, shaking her head wisely. "If she doesn't show her feelings at all, even to the man she loves, she may lose the opportunity of catching him. Jane should use every moment she gets with Bingley to attract and encourage him." "But I consider a man should try to discover a woman's feelings, not wait for her encouragement. And Jane probably doesn't know what her real feelings for Bingley are yet. She has only seen him a few times, not often enough to understand his character, or be sure that she really loves him." "Well, I wish Jane success with all my heart," said Charlotte finally. "But I think she'd have as much chance of happiness if she married him tomorrow as if she studied his character for a whole year. Happiness in marriage is simply a question of chance. I think it's better to know as little as possible about the person you're going to spend your life with." Elizabeth laughed, sure that Charlotte did not mean what she was saying. While observing Mr. Bingley's interest in Jane, however, Elizabeth had not noticed Mr. Darcy's interest in herself. Although at first he had not even considered her pretty, he now began to realise what a beautiful expression her dark eyes gave to her intelligent face, and what an attractive figure she had. "Of course, she is only an unfashionable village girl," he told himself, "but her conversation is often quite amusing." Whenever they met, he did not speak to her, but stood near her, listening to her and watching her closely, conscious of a wish to know her better. One evening, at a party at the Lucases' house, Darcy was standing alone, as usual, away from the other guests watching the dancing. His host, Sir William, came to speak to him. "Mr. Darcy, are you enjoying the dancing, sir? What a delightful entertainment it is." Darcy frowned. "Yes," he said with cool disdain. "It's something that any uneducated person can be good at." "I'm sure you're good at dancing yourself, sir," replied Sir William cheerfully. "Look, here's Miss Elizabeth Bennet." She was crossing the room at that moment. "Let me persuade you to dance with her. You cannot refuse to dance when so much beauty is in front of you." "Indeed, sir," replied Elizabeth quickly in some embarrassment. "I have no intention of dancing. You must excuse me." "Miss Bennet, please allow me the pleasure of dancing with you," said Mr. Darcy politely, holding out his hand. But with equal politeness, Elizabeth refused again, and turned away. Mr. Darcy was watching her walk away, with a slight smile on his face, when Caroline Bingley came up to him.
"Mr. Darcy," she said, "I'm sure I know what you're thinking. How boring all these silly little country people are."
"Not at all, Miss Bingley. In fact, I was just thinking what pleasure a pair of fine eyes can give."
"Really? And who do these fine eyes belong to, may I ask?"
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
"Well, let me be the first to congratulate you, Mr. Darcy. When will the wedding be?"
"Ah, that's what I expected you to say. A lady's imagination jumps from admiration to love to marriage in a moment."
"Well, of course, when you're married, you will often have her charming mother and sisters to stay. How delightful for you!"
And Miss Bingley, seeing that Darcy remained calm, continued to mock the Bennet family as amusingly as she could. Chapter 2. Jane's Illness, Mr. Bennet had a comfortable income of £2,000 a year and a pleasant house in Longbourn. But unfortunately for his daughters, after his death, all his property would pass to a distant male relation. Mrs. Bennet's father had been a lawyer and had only left his daughter a small amount of money. She had a brother who owned shops in London, and she also had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips. He had been her father's clerk and now carried on his late employer's business. Mr. and Mrs. Phillips lived in Meryton, which was only a kilometre or so from the village of Longbourn. It was a most convenient distance for the Bennet girls, who were usually tempted there 3 or 4 times a week to visit their aunt or a dressmaker who lived opposite. The youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia, were particularly regular visitors. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and if no better entertainment was available, a walk to Meryton always provided some amusement, as well as interesting local news from their aunt. The latest news, which delighted Kitty and Lydia, was that the regiment, which had recently arrived in Meryton, was to stay there for the whole winter. The 2 girls now visited their aunt every day, and as Mr. Phillips knew all the officers, Kitty and Lydia were soon introduced to them. At home, they could talk of nothing but officers and their handsome uniforms. Even Mr. Bingley's fortune now seemed hardly worth considering. After listening to their praise of the officers one morning, Mr. Bennet said coolly, "From what I can see, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country. I've suspected it for some time, but now I'm convinced." Kitty was embarrassed and did not reply, but Lydia, the youngest, continued to express her admiration for a certain Captain Carter with perfect indifference. "I am very surprised, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. As it happens, they are all very clever." "That is the only point, I think, on which we do not agree. I am afraid I must say that I consider our 2 youngest daughters unusually foolish."
My dear Mr. Bennet, you mustn't expect such young girls to have the common sense of their father or mother. I remember when I used to like a red coat myself, and indeed I still do. If a good-looking officer with 5,000 or 6,000 a year wanted to marry one of my girls, I wouldn't turn him down. And I thought Colonel Forster looked very handsome last night at Sir William's in his regimental uniform."
Just then, a servant entered with a note for Jane, which had come from Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet's eyes shone with pleasure, and she called out eagerly while her daughter was reading it.
"Well, Jane, who is it from? What does he say? Tell us quickly, my love." "It's from Miss Bingley," said Jane. "She invites me to dinner at Netherfield, as she and her sister are alone. It seems her brother and the gentleman are having dinner with the officers in Meryton." "With the officers?" cried Lydia. "I wonder why Aunt Phillips didn't tell us that." "Having dinner in Meryton?" repeated Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. "That's very unlucky." "May I take the carriage?" asked Jane. "No, my dear. You'd better ride over there, because it looks likely to rain, and then you'll have to stay the night."
"That would be a good plan," said Elizabeth to her mother, "if you were sure they wouldn't offer to send her home in their carriage."
"Oh, but they can't. The gentleman must have taken Mr. Bingley's carriage to go to Meryton."
"I'd much rather go in the carriage," Jane said.
"But, my dear, your father can't spare the horses, I'm sure. They're needed on the farm, aren't they, Mr. Bennet?"
Mr. Bennet finally agreed that they were in fact being used that day in the fields. So Jane set out on her horse, while her mother called cheerfully after her, "I do hope it'll rain heavily, my love." And Jane had not been gone for long before it rained hard. Elizabeth was a little worried about her sister, but Mrs. Bennet was delighted.
"What a good idea of mine that was,"
she said more than once, extremely pleased with herself. Not until the next morning, however, did she realise the full extent of her success. After breakfast, a servant from Netherfield arrived with a note from Jane to Elizabeth. explaining that Jane had caught cold on her wet ride and had been invited to stay at Netherfield until she recovered. "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, "if your daughter should become seriously ill and die, it would be a comfort to know that she died in a good cause and in obedience to your orders."
"Oh, I'm not afraid of her dying. People don't die of colds. She'll be looked after well at Netherfield. As long as she stays there, everything will be all right."
But Elizabeth felt really anxious and was determined to go to her sister. As the carriage was not available and she was not keen on riding, she decided to walk the 5 kilometres to Netherfield. Kitty and Lydia accompanied her as far as Meryton, where they went to visit one of the officers' wives. Elizabeth continued alone, crossing field after field and jumping impatiently over streams in her anxiety to see her sister. When she arrived at Netherfield, with tired feet, muddy stockings, and a face healthily pink with exercise, she was shown straight into the sitting-room. The 2 sisters, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, could hardly believe that she had come so far alone and on foot in such bad weather, but they received her politely. Their brother, however, was more than polite. He was kind and considerate towards her. Mr. Darcy said very little, hesitating between admiration of her healthy good looks and doubt whether she should have come such a distance alone. Mr. Hurst said nothing at all, as he was thinking only of his breakfast. Elizabeth was glad to be taken almost immediately to her sister's room, where she found Jane delighted to see her, but very feverish and unwell. The doctor came, and after examining his patient, advised that she should stay in bed and take some medicine. Elizabeth stayed with her all day, looking after her, and the Bingley sisters also spent some time in the patient's room. However, in the afternoon, when it was time for Elizabeth to leave, Jane seemed so upset that Miss Bingley was obliged to invite Elizabeth to stay at Netherfield for the present, and a servant was sent to Longbourn to inform the Bennet family and bring back some clothes. That evening, Elizabeth went down to dinner, leaving Jane in bed in her room. She noticed the Bingley sisters' apparent concern for Jane changed to indifference in a few moments, and knew she had been right to dislike them at first sight. Mr. Bingley, indeed, was the only one of the group whose behaviour she was satisfied with. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his politeness towards herself most pleasing. But the others, she felt, treated her as an unwelcome guest. Miss Bingley was concentrating all her attention on Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Hurst also joined in their conversation, while Mr. Hurst was only interested in eating, drinking, and playing cards. When Elizabeth left the room after dinner to see if Jane needed anything, Miss Bingley at once began to criticise her.
"What bad manners she has! She's both proud and lacking in politeness to her superiors. She has no conversation, no elegance, and no beauty."
Mrs. Hurst agreed and added,
"She has no good qualities, except that she's an excellent walker. I'll never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. How silly of her to come at all. Why must she run around the countryside just because her sister has a cold? Her hair looked so untidy, and her dress simply covered in mud."
"I must say," said Bingley, "I didn't notice any of that. I thought she looked remarkably attractive when she arrived this morning."
"You observed her wild appearance, I'm sure, Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley, "and I imagine you wouldn't wish your sister to make such a show of herself."
"Certainly not."
"Walking 4 or 5 kilometres, whatever it was, up to her ankles in mud, and alone, quite alone. It seems to me to show a dreadful sort of independence, a country girl's indifference to what is acceptable."
"I think it shows a very pleasing affection for her sister," said Bingley.
"I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy," whispered Miss Bingley, "that this adventure has rather lessened your admiration of her fine eyes."
"Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." After a short pause, Mrs. Hurst began again. I have a great liking for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well married. But with such a father and mother, and with such vulgar relations, I'm afraid there's no chance of it.
I think the Bennet girls have an uncle who's a lawyer in Meryton.
Yes, and they have another who owns shops in Cheapside. Such a nice part of London. Both the sisters laughed. If they had enough uncles to fill Cheapside, cried Bingley, it wouldn't make them any less charming. But it must considerably lessen their chances of marrying men of any position in the world, replied Darcy. Bingley did not answer, but his sisters agreed enthusiastically, and continued mocking their dear friend's vulgar relations for some time. Late in the evening, when Elizabeth was satisfied that Jane was asleep, she felt she ought to go downstairs again. She found the party in the sitting-room playing cards, but although they invited her to join in their game, she refused politely and picked up a book to read. "I can fetch you more books to read if you wish," offered Bingley, "but I'm afraid I haven't got a large library. Unlike you, I'm too lazy to spend much time reading."
"What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley. "And what a beautiful house it is. Charles, when you buy your house, I hope it will be even half as lovely as Pemberley."
"I hope so too," agreed Bingley.
"And your dear sister, Mr. Darcy. I expect she's grown since the spring. I want so much to see her again. I've never met anyone who delighted me so much. Such an appearance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age."
"I'm always surprised," said Bingley, "to find how very accomplished all young ladies are. How do they have the time and patience to learn all these skills?" "Certainly people use the word accomplished too loosely," said Darcy. "But I am far from agreeing with you about ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than 6 who are really accomplished." "Then," said Elizabeth, "your idea of an accomplished woman must include a great many qualities." "Yes, a great many."
"Oh, certainly,"
cried his faithful assistant, Miss Bingley.
"An accomplished woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. And besides this, a certain something in her manner of walking, in her voice, and in her behaviour."
"All this she must possess," added Darcy, "and something more solid, the improvement of her mind by wide reading." "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women," said Elizabeth. "I rather wonder at your knowing any. I've never seen such elegance and intelligence and knowledge as you describe in one woman." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley were both protesting loudly that they knew many women like this when Mr. Hurst called their attention back to the card game. As this meant an end to the conversation, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room.
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet," said Miss Bingley to Darcy, "is one of those women who try to appear attractive to men by undervaluing other women. I think that's a mean trick."
"It is true," said Darcy, "that there is meanness in all the tricks used by ladies to attract men." Miss Bingley was not satisfied enough with this answer to continue the conversation. The next morning, Elizabeth was glad to be able to inform Mr. Bingley and his sisters that Jane was very much better. In spite of this improvement, however, she asked for her mother to be sent for, as she wanted Mrs. Bennet's opinion of Jane's state of health. Soon after breakfast, therefore, Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her 2 youngest daughters, reached Netherfield. Elizabeth, although relieved to hear that her mother did not think Jane's illness serious, began to regret asking her to come when she saw the Bingley sisters smiling at Mrs. Bennet's remarks. Elizabeth blushed for her mother, who could not help showing her lack of intelligence and common sense in everything she said. Kitty and Lydia made an equally bad impression. They had been whispering together when suddenly Lydia, who was an attractive, confident, well-grown girl of 15, pushed herself rudely forward. She begged Mr. Bingley to hold a ball at Netherfield. With his usual politeness, Mr. Bingley promised he would, but Elizabeth saw his sisters exchanging meaningful glances. She was quite glad when her mother and sisters left. She and Jane were to stay another night at Netherfield to allow Jane to recover completely. That evening, Elizabeth appeared again in the sitting-room. She could not avoid noticing how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. But as she felt sure that so great a man could not possibly admire her, she assumed that when he looked at her, he was criticising her in some way. This thought did not cause her any pain, as she liked him too little to care for his approval. In the conversation she had with him, she spoke in her usual slightly mocking manner, rather expecting to offend him, but was surprised by the quiet politeness of his replies. Darcy had never before been so charmed by any woman. He really believed that if she did not have such vulgar relations, he might be in danger of falling in love with her. Miss Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane was increased by her wish to get rid of Elizabeth. Fortunately, perhaps, for almost everyone at Netherfield, Elizabeth and her sister, who was now quite recovered, were returning home the next day. Only Mr. Bingley showed real sorrow at this, and was concerned that Jane might not be fit enough to travel. Mr. Darcy was quite relieved, and determined that no sign of admiration for Elizabeth should escape him now. Miss Bingley's politeness to Elizabeth, as well as her affection for Jane, increased rapidly as the moment of departure approached, and she was able to say good-bye to them with many warm expressions of friendliness and a promise to visit them very soon. Mr. Bennet was glad to welcome his eldest daughters home again, as he had felt their absence from the family circle. But Mrs. Bennet, who had hoped they would stay much longer, was quite disappointed to see them come back in such a short time. Chapter 3. Mr. Collins visits Longbourn. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife at breakfast the next morning, "that you have told the cook to send up a good dinner today, as I am expecting a visitor."
"Who is it, my dear? I know of nobody who is coming, unless Charlotte Lucas happens to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her."
"The person I'm talking about is a gentleman and a stranger." Mrs. Bennet's eyes shone with excitement.
"It's Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Why, Jane, you never mentioned it. Well, I'll be extremely glad to see him. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to the cook at once."
"It is not Mr. Bingley," said her husband. "It's a person whom I have never seen before." This caused general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters all at the same time. Having amused himself for some time with their curiosity, he finally explained. "I have recently received a letter from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, as you know, will inherit all my property when I die, and may throw you out of this house as soon as he wants."
"Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "please don't mention that hateful man. It's the hardest thing in the world to accept the fact that your property is not left to your own children, and I'm sure, if I were you, I'd have tried to do something about it."
Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain the legal situation to her again. They had often attempted to do this before, but it was a matter which Mrs. Bennet refused to understand, and she continued to complain bitterly about Mr. Collins. "It certainly is most unjust," agreed Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting this house. But if you listen while I read his letter to you, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." He read aloud the following letter. "Dear Sir, the disagreement between you and my late respected father always worried me, and since his death I have frequently wished to improve the relationship between our families. After a long period of study and training, I have recently become a priest, and have been fortunate enough to gain the patronage of Lady Catherine de Burgh, widow of Sir Louis de Burgh. This generous lady has given me the post of rector at Hunsford, which was luckily vacant. Hunsford is the village near her own large country house in Kent. Here I carry out the duties of my profession whenever necessary, and I take great care to behave at all times with grateful respect towards her ladyship. As a priest, moreover, I feel it my duty to encourage all families in my area of influence to live peacefully. Because of this, I flatter myself that I am acting correctly in offering you my friendship. I am, of course, concerned that when I eventually inherit all your property, your daughters will doubtless be very poor, and I do apologize for this. I promise you I am ready to make amends in every possible way, but more about this later. If you do not object, I propose to visit you and your family on Monday, November the 18th at 4 o'clock, and shall probably stay until the following Saturday week. This will cause me no inconvenience at all, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence from my duties. I remain, dear sir, with respectful good wishes to your lady and your daughters, your friend, William Collins.
So, we can expect this peacemaking gentleman at 4 o'clock today,
said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter.
He appears to be a most polite and serious young man. How considerate of Lady Catherine to allow him to visit us.
Well, if he is ready to make amends to the girls in some way, I shall certainly not discourage him, said Mrs. Bennet. Although it's difficult, said Jane, to guess how he intends to do that. It's good of him to want to help us. I think he's peculiar, said Elizabeth. He sounds too pleased with himself, and he speaks so politely of Lady Catherine. And why does he apologise for inheriting father's property in future? We know it's not his fault. Can he be a sensible man, sir? She added, turning to Mr. Bennet.
No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the opposite. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises to be entertaining. I am impatient to see him.
Mary, the middle daughter, who spent most of her time reading and who seldom joined in family conversation, now remarked that in her opinion his letter was well expressed. But Kitty and Lydia did not show any interest in the letter or its writer. As it was highly unlikely that their cousin would arrive in a regimental uniform, they could not imagine having any pleasure in meeting him. Their mother, however, had changed her attitude towards Mr. Collins after his letter, and was now preparing to meet him with such calmness that it astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins arrived punctually, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins did not seem in need of encouragement. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His expression was serious and his manners very formal. Soon after his arrival, he said to Mrs. Bennet,
Madam, I must compliment you on having such a fine family of daughters. I had heard much of their beauty, but I find them even more beautiful than reports have stated. I do not doubt you will see them all well married quite soon.
Mrs. Bennet never quarrelled with compliments, and she answered,
You are very kind, sir, and indeed I do hope so, because otherwise they'll have nothing at all to live on. You refer, perhaps, to my inheriting the Bennet property. Ah, yes, sir, I do. You must confess it is a sad business for my poor girls. I am very aware, madam, of the hardship to your lovely daughters, and could say more about this, but I am cautious of saying too much too soon. But I would like to say that I have come prepared to admire the young ladies, and perhaps when we know each other better—
The bell rang for dinner, and the family moved into the dining-room with their guest. The girls smiled secretly at each other as Mr. Collins praised the hall, the dining-room, and all the furniture. Mrs. Bennet would normally have been delighted with such praise, but she could not help thinking that he was perhaps admiring it all as his future property. The dinner, too, he considered excellent, and he asked which of his charming cousins was responsible for it. But Mrs. Bennet explained quite sharply to him that they were very well able to afford a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged her pardon immediately for offending her, and continued to apologise for about a quarter of an hour. Mr. Bennet had hardly spoken up to now, but he thought it was time to enter the conversation.
You seem very fortunate in your patron, Mr. Collins, he said.
He could not have chosen a better opening remark. Mr. Collins spoke enthusiastically for several minutes in praise of Lady Catherine.
Never in my life have I witnessed such considerate behaviour in a person of high birth. Although she is such a great lady, she has never treated me with disdain. She talks to me almost as an equal and gives me advice. For example, she has recommended me to marry as soon as possible. And do you know, she has asked me to dinner twice at her house. Some people consider her proud, but she has only ever been kind to me. She even took the trouble to visit my small house, and was thoughtful enough to suggest 1 or 2 improvements, some shelves upstairs.
"That is very correct and polite, I'm sure," said Mrs. Bennet. "Does she live near you, sir?"
Only a small country road separates my poor house from Rosings Park, her ladyship's home.
"I think you said she is a widow. Has she any family?"
She has only 1 daughter, who will inherit Rosings and all Lady Catherine's property. A most charming young lady, unfortunately in weak health. I often pay her some little compliment on her appearance or her accomplishments when I visit Rosings. Lady Catherine appreciates these compliments to her daughter, and I see it as my duty to please her ladyship.
"I am sure you're right," said Mr. Bennet. "No doubt you are expert at flattering with delicacy. May I ask how you think of these pleasing compliments?"
Some of them come to me at the time, but in my spare moments I do occasionally prepare a few words which may be suitable for different occasions.
Mr. Bennet listened to his cousin with the greatest enjoyment. Mr. Collins was as foolish as he had hoped. But by tea-time Mr. Bennet had had enough, and after tea asked his guest to read aloud to the ladies. However, when a novel was handed to Mr. Collins, he looked shocked, and protested that he never read novels. He chose a religious book instead, and started reading in a slow, serious voice. Lydia could not hide her boredom for long, and after only 3 pages she interrupted him rudely to ask her mother a question about one of the officers in Meryton. Mr. Collins was offended, and refused to read any more, although Mrs. Bennet and her other daughters apologised for Lydia's lack of manners. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and neither education nor society had improved him. The respect he felt for his patron, and his very good opinion of himself and his new position, made him proud and servile at the same time. Now that he had a home and a considerable income, he had decided to marry. The Bennet girls, who would lose their inheritance because of him, had a reputation for being attractive and charming, and his idea of making amends to them was to marry one of them. He considered this an excellent plan, and thought himself extremely generous and unselfish in carrying it out. He had known he was right when he arrived at Longbourn and saw Jane Bennet's lovely face. As the eldest, she should marry first, and for the first evening she was his choice. But the next morning, after a 15-minute conversation with Mrs. Bennet, he had to change his mind. When he explained that he was hoping to find a wife among her daughters, she replied with a happy smile that her eldest daughter was very likely to be engaged soon. "But there are my other daughters, Mr. Collins," she continued encouragingly. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was pouring the tea. Next to Jane in birth and beauty, Elizabeth was the obvious choice. Mrs. Bennet was delighted, hoping that she might soon have 2 daughters married. The man whom she had so disliked the day before was now a favourite with her. Chapter 4. Elizabeth meets Mr. Wickham. When later that morning Lydia suggested walking to Meryton to see some of the officers, all her sisters except Mary agreed to accompany her. Even Mr. Collins went with them, encouraged by Mr. Bennet, who was by now most anxious to have some time to himself. During their walk, the girls listened politely to Mr. Collins' self-important speeches. But as soon as they entered Meryton, the younger ones no longer even pretended to be interested in his conversation, but looked eagerly around in search of the officers. Just then, all the young ladies noticed a very gentlemanlike young man whom they'd never seen before, walking down the street with an officer they knew. They were all wondering who the handsome stranger could be when the officer came up to them to greet them. He asked permission to introduce his friend, whose name was Mr. Wickham, and who had apparently arrived recently from London to become an officer in the regiment. This was exactly as it should be, because the young man only needed an officer's uniform to become completely charming. He was very good-looking, with a very pleasant, sociable manner, and after the introductions, conversation flowed most enjoyably in the little group. They were still standing and talking happily together when they heard the sound of horses and saw Darcy and Bingley riding down the street. The two gentlemen came straight towards the ladies to greet them. Bingley was clearly most interested in Jane Bennet and started talking particularly to her. Darcy, however, was just determining not to look at Elizabeth when he suddenly noticed the stranger. By chance, Elizabeth saw Darcy's and Wickham's faces at the moment when they caught sight of each other, and she was astonished at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour, one white, the other red. After a few moments, Mr. Wickham touched his hat, and Mr. Darcy nodded very slightly. What could this mean? It was impossible to imagine, and it was impossible not to wish to know. In another moment, Mr. Bingley, who did not seem to have noticed what had happened, said good-bye and rode away with Mr. Darcy. The two officers accompanied the young ladies to Mrs. Phillips's house, but did not go in spite of Lydia's repeated invitations. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and welcomed Mr. Collins most politely when he was introduced to her. She did not, however, have any more information for the girls about the agreeable Mr. Wickham.
"But I tell you what, my dears," she said brightly, "I'm giving a little supper party for some of the officers tomorrow. I'll ask Mr. Phillips to visit Mr. Wickham and invite him to come too. Will you all come as well?" The girls were delighted, and agreed at once to this arrangement, and the whole group walked back to Longbourn, happily discussing the enjoyable evening they were going to have. Mr. Collins had been very impressed with Mrs. Phillips's politeness, and when they reached Longbourn, he complimented Mrs. Bennet on her sister's elegance and charming manners. The next evening, the carriage took him and his 5 cousins to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the hall, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was at that moment in the house. When Mr. Collins was shown into the sitting-room, and had time to look around and admire it, he said immediately to Mrs. Phillips, "Madam, I must compliment you on the size and furniture of this room. Really, I could almost imagine myself in the smaller summer breakfast-room at Rosings." This remark did not at first please his hostess very much, but when she heard from him what Rosings was, and who its owner was, and how much Lady Catherine's furniture cost, she realised what a great compliment it was. During the evening, Mr. Collins found Mrs. Phillips a kind and attentive listener, which was fortunate, as the Bennet girls could not bring themselves to listen to him any longer. All the ladies were impatient to see Mr. Wickham, and when he came into the room, he appeared far more charming and gentlemanly than any of the officers present. He was the lucky man towards whom almost every female eye turned, and Elizabeth was the lucky woman beside whom he finally took his seat. His pleasant way of making conversation made her feel that he could talk interestingly about anything. As he did not play cards, which some of the party were doing, he stayed talking to Elizabeth for a large part of the evening. She hoped he would tell her how he knew Mr. Darcy, but she dared not mention that gentleman. Luckily, however, Mr. Wickham himself began to talk about it, although in a rather hesitating manner. "Netherfield is quite near Meryton, I suppose. How long has Mr. Darcy been staying there?"
"He has been there about a month," replied Elizabeth. Unwilling to let the matter drop, she added, "He is a man of very large property in Derbyshire, I understand."
"Yes," replied Wickham. "His income is 10,000 a year at least. I know more about him than most people, as I've been closely connected with his family since childhood."
Elizabeth could only look surprised.
"You might well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at my saying that, after noticing, as you probably did, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Do you know Mr. Darcy well?"
"As well as I ever wished to," cried Elizabeth. "I've spent 4 days in the same house as him, and I consider him very disagreeable."
I've known him too long and too well to judge fairly whether he's disagreeable or not, but I believe most people would be astonished by your opinion.
He is not at all liked here in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You won't find him praised by anyone.
I can't pretend to be sorry that he is valued as he deserves, but with him I believe it doesn't often happen. The world is blinded by his fortune and importance, or frightened by his proud behaviour, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen.
After a pause, Wickham added,
I wonder if he's likely to stay at Netherfield much longer.
I don't know at all, but I hope his presence won't stop you becoming an officer in the regiment here.
Oh, no, I won't be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. The reason I have for avoiding him is one I could easily make public to the whole world. He has treated me very badly. His late father, Miss Bennet, was one of the best men who ever lived, and the most faithful friend I ever had. And whenever I'm with this Mr. Darcy, I think of his father with the most painful regret. Mr. Darcy has behaved wickedly towards me, but I could forgive him anything except the insult to his father's memory.
Elizabeth was fascinated and listened eagerly, but did not like to ask any questions. Mr. Wickham began to speak more generally about Meryton and the charming people he had met there.
In fact, that's why I was tempted to join the regiment. I'd heard that Meryton society is most agreeable. Society, I confess, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, you see. I did not intend to join the army at all. The church ought to have been my profession, and I should at this moment have a comfortable income as a Derbyshire rector, if the gentleman we were speaking of just now had wished it.
Indeed?
Yes. Mr. Darcy's father had always been very fond of me, and intended to give me the post of rector of Pemberley. But unfortunately, after his death, when the post became vacant, it was given to someone else.
No, cried Elizabeth, horrified. But how could that happen? Why didn't you get legal advice and claim what was rightfully yours?
Mr. Darcy's father had not stated his wish in writing. A man of honour could not have doubted his intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to treat it as a recommendation only. I really cannot accuse myself of having done anything to deserve to lose the post. The fact is, he hates me. I think he was jealous of his father's affection for me, which annoyed him from the beginning.
This is very shocking. I hadn't thought Mr. Darcy as bad as this, although I've never liked him. I assumed he felt superior to everyone else, but did not suspect him of behaving in such a wicked, unjust, inhuman way.
We grew up together at Pemberley, you know. My father gave up all his time to take care of the Pemberley farms, and was greatly appreciated as a close friend by the late Mr. Darcy, who promised, just before my father's death, to provide for me. The present Mr. Darcy did not choose to respect that promise.
How strange that Mr. Darcy's pride has not made him help you. Surely he's too proud to wish to appear dishonest, which is what I must call him.
He's certainly very proud. Proud of his position, his family, his father, and his sister too, you know.
What sort of a girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head.
It gives me pain to criticise a Darcy, but she's too much like her brother. Very, very proud. She's a handsome girl of about 15 or 16, and I understand extremely accomplished.
I am astonished at Mr. Darcy's close friendship with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems so charming and kind, be friendly with such a man?
I don't know Mr. Bingley at all, but Mr. Darcy can be a pleasant companion if he thinks it worthwhile.
Just then they were joined by some of the others, and the conversation became more general. When Mr. Collins was talking to Mrs. Phillips about his patron, Mr. Wickham looked quickly in his direction, and then asked Elizabeth,
"Does your cousin know Lady Catherine de Bourgh very well?"
"I don't think he has known her for long, but she has recently given him the post of rector of Hunsford."
"Perhaps you know that Lady Catherine is the present Mr. Darcy's aunt. I believe she is planning to marry her daughter, who will inherit a fortune, to Mr. Darcy."
This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley's efforts to attract Mr. Darcy, which might all be in vain. The supper party came to an end, and Elizabeth went away with her head full of Mr. Wickham. She could think of nothing but him and what he had told her all the way home. The next day, She told Jane everything she had discussed with Mr. Wickham. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She could not believe that Mr. Darcy could so little deserve Mr. Bingley's friendship, and yet she did not want to doubt the truthfulness of such an agreeable young man as Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth, however, felt sure that Mr. Darcy was to blame. That morning, an invitation arrived at Longbourn. Mr. Bingley had fixed the date for the ball he had promised to give at Netherfield, and it was to be on the following Tuesday. Every female in the Bennet family was looking forward to it, even Mary, who lifted her head from her book to say, unsmiling, "As long as I have my mornings free for serious reading, I do not mind meeting people in the evenings. I consider some relaxation and amusement is good for everybody." Elizabeth felt so cheerful at the thought of dancing with Mr. Wickham that she made an unusual effort to speak kindly to Mr. Collins. "Will you accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, sir? And if you do, will you, as a priest, consider it right to dance?"
"I shall certainly accept, and I am so far from objecting to dancing that I hope to have the honour of dancing with all my beautiful cousins. I take this opportunity of asking you, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances especially."
She was very surprised and rather annoyed. She had hoped that Wickham would ask her for those dances, but now she would have Mr. Collins instead. She could not refuse, however, and his request also worried her in another way. His manner to her seemed particularly flattering, which gave her the unwelcome idea that perhaps she had been chosen from among her sisters to be the rector of Hunsford's wife. As she observed the increasing number of compliments he paid to her beauty and character, she felt sure that he intended to propose marriage. For the moment, however, she decided to do nothing but wait and see. On Tuesday evening, when Elizabeth entered the hall at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the red coats gathered there, she was surprised and disappointed to see he was not present. She had never doubted he would come, and had dressed with more than her usual care, looking forward to winning his heart, which she knew was already partly hers. But she immediately suspected that Darcy had persuaded Bingley not to invite Wickham, and although she discovered from one of the officers that in fact Wickham had been invited, but had been called away on business, she felt sure Wickham had wanted to avoid meeting Darcy, and blamed Darcy for this. As a result, when Darcy greeted her, she was so annoyed with him that she could hardly reply politely. But she soon became more cheerful, and determined to enjoy the ball in spite of Wickham's absence. Unfortunately, the first 2 dances with Mr. Collins were painfully embarrassing, as her cousin had no idea how to dance and moved extremely awkwardly. She was relieved to leave him, and have the 3rd dance with an officer, who gave her great pleasure by talking about Wickham and his popularity in the regiment. After this, she was very surprised to be approached by Mr. Darcy and invited to dance. She was so astonished, in fact, that she accepted him without thinking, and found herself standing opposite him on the dance floor. "What an honour for me to be allowed to dance with Mr. Darcy," she thought. They danced for some time in silence, and then she made a remark. He replied, and was silent again. After a pause, she spoke again. "Now you must say something, Mr. Darcy. You could remark on the size of the room, or the number of couples." He smiled. "I'll say whatever you wish me to say." "Very well. That reply will do for the moment. Perhaps soon I'll observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we can be silent. Conversation needs to be arranged in this way so that those people who don't enjoy talking are not required to make any effort." "Are you referring to yourself, or are you thinking of me?" "Both," said Elizabeth, smiling, "because I think you and I are similar. We're both unsociable and unwilling to speak, unless we can astonish and impress the whole room." "I am sure you aren't like that," he answered. "I cannot say whether I am or not. You obviously think so." She said nothing. "Do you and your sisters often go to Meryton?" he continued. "We do," she replied, and unable to resist the temptation, she added, "When you met us there last week, we had just been introduced to someone." The effect was immediate. There was a new coldness in Darcy's expression. After a moment he said with difficulty,
Mr. Wickham is so agreeable that he makes friends easily. Whether he can keep them is less certain."
"He has been unlucky enough to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth sharply, "and in a way which will cause him hardship all his life." Darcy did not reply to this, and there was only time for a little more conversation before the dance ended. Elizabeth went to find Jane, and listened with delight as she described her feelings for Bingley and her confidence in his affection for her. But apart from Jane, it seemed to Elizabeth that if her family had made an agreement to appear as stupid as possible during the ball, they could not have been more successful. First, Mr. Collins insisted on going to introduce himself to Mr. Darcy, the nephew of his respected patron, and was received very coldly. Then, during supper, Mrs. Bennet could not be prevented from talking very loudly to Lady Lucas about her great hopes of Jane's marriage to Bingley. Elizabeth blushed in embarrassment when she realised that the Bingley sisters and Mr. Darcy were able to hear. Finally, when some music was required, Mary Bennet went confidently to the piano and sang and played several songs, all rather badly. The rest of the evening brought Elizabeth little amusement. She could not even go and talk to people she knew, as Mr. Collins seemed determined to stay close by her side all evening. Fortunately, her good friend Charlotte Lucas occasionally gave her some relief by kindly listening to some of Mr. Collins' long speeches. At least Elizabeth did not have to talk to Mr. Darcy any more. He often stood near her, quite alone, but did not come close enough to speak. At the end of the evening, it was obvious to Elizabeth that although her family had greatly enjoyed the ball, the Bingley sisters were eager for these particular guests to leave. Mr. Collins, however, was enthusiastic in his praise of the Bingleys' hospitality, and Mrs. Bennet invited the whole Bingley family to visit Longbourn as soon as possible. She was feeling very satisfied, convinced that in 3 or 4 months Jane would be married to Bingley. She was also sure that Elizabeth would marry Mr. Collins. This was a good enough marriage for Elizabeth, who was her least favourite daughter, but not nearly as impressive as Jane's marriage to Bingley. Chapter 5. Mr. Collins proposes twice. At Longbourn the next day, soon after breakfast, Mr. Collins asked Mrs. Bennet for permission to speak privately to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet was delighted, and hurried the other girls out of the room so that Elizabeth and Mr. Collins were left alone together. Elizabeth did not want to stay, and got up to leave, but after a moment's thought, sat down again quietly, determined to listen and reply politely.
"My dear Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Collins seriously, "this little unwillingness to hear me, this modesty of yours, can only add to your other charms. You can hardly doubt the purpose of my speech. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I chose you as the companion of my future life. But before I am carried away by my feelings, I think I should state my reasons for marrying."
Elizabeth was trying so hard not to laugh at the idea of Mr. Collins being carried away by his feelings that she was unable to reply.
"First," he continued, "it is right for a priest to marry as an example to other people. Secondly, I'm sure marriage will add greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I should have mentioned earlier, my generous patron has advised me to marry. Find an active, useful sort of person, she told me, a woman who can make a small income go a long way. Bring her to Hunsford as your wife, and I'll visit her. So I decided to choose a wife from among my Bennet cousins to lessen the loss to the family when the sad event of your father's death takes place. I flatter myself